In the final months of the Second World War, as Allied forces advanced deeper into German territory, a small number of American military intelligence officers were operating under orders that had almost nothing to do with defeating the remaining German army. Their objective was narrower and, in the long run, considerably more consequential. Locate, secure, and extract Germany's leading rocket scientists and engineers before Soviet forces, advancing from the east, could reach them first. At the center of this effort stood the engineering team responsible for the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, a weapon that had killed thousands of civilians in London and Antwerp during the war's final year, and whose underlying technology represented, in the assessment of American military planners, the single most significant advance in weapons engineering to emerge from the entire conflict. The man at the center of this technology, Wernher von Braun, had anticipated exactly this race for his expertise months before Germany's formal surrender. As Soviet forces closed in from the east and the German rocket program's research facility at Peenemünde became untenable, von Braun made the calculated decision to move his core engineering team, along with critical technical documentation, westward toward American lines rather than remain in territory likely to fall under Soviet control. On May 2, 1945, von Braun and roughly 500 of his key personnel formally surrendered to American forces near the Austrian border, a decision driven less by any particular loyalty to the United States than by a clear-eyed assessment of which occupying power was more likely to allow their research to continue, and under considerably more favorable post-war conditions than Soviet custody would likely provide. The scientists who surrendered to American forces presented an immediate and deeply uncomfortable legal and ethical problem for the United States government. Von Braun and numerous members of his engineering team had held membership in the Nazi Party, a standard requirement for advancement within German state-sponsored research institutions during the Third Reich, and several senior figures within the rocket program, most notably Arthur Rudolph, had held direct supervisory roles at the underground Mittelwerk production facility, where V-2 rockets were manufactured using slave labor drawn primarily from the nearby Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Conditions at the Mittelwerk facility were catastrophic, even by the standards of Nazi forced labor programs, with an estimated 20,000 prisoners dying during the facility's roughly 20 months of operation, a death toll that exceeded the total number of people killed by the V-2 rockets the facility produced. Existing American immigration law at the time explicitly barred the entry of former Nazi Party members and individuals who had participated in war crimes, a legal barrier that, if strictly enforced, would have prevented the transfer of von Braun's team to the United States entirely. Rather than abandon the recruitment effort, American military and intelligence officials developed a program, formally established under a directive from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and initially operating under the codename Operation Overcast before being renamed Operation Paperclip, that involved systematically sanitizing the official records and background files of selected German scientists, removing or downplaying documentation of Nazi Party membership and, in several documented cases, more direct involvement in the exploitation of forced labor in order to allow their immigration applications to proceed without triggering existing legal restrictions. The mechanics of this sanitization process were coordinated, primarily through the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, a body established specifically to manage the recruitment, vetting, and immigration of German scientific personnel under Operation Paperclip. Case files for recruited scientists were reviewed and, where necessary, revised to remove or soften references to Nazi Party involvement, membership in SS-affiliated organizations, or direct participation in facilities associated with forced labor and war crimes. Arthur Rudolph's file, despite his direct operational oversight of production at Mittelwerk during the period of its most severe labor abuses, was successfully sanitized sufficiently to allow his immigration and subsequent decades-long career within the American rocket program, a fact that would not become widely known or publicly scrutinized until the 1980s, when renewed historical investigation into his wartime record led to his voluntary departure from the United States rather than face formal denaturalization proceedings. This sanitization was not conducted in ignorance of the underlying facts. American officials involved in the program were, in numerous documented cases, fully aware of the scientists' Nazi Party affiliations and, in some instances, aware of direct connections to forced labor facilities, but proceeded regardless, driven by an assessment that the strategic and technological value of securing this expertise, particularly in the emerging context of Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, outweighed the moral and legal complications involved. Approximately 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were eventually brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip and its associated follow-on programs between 1945 and the early 1950s, spanning fields well beyond rocketry, including aerodynamics, medicine, and chemical weapons research, though the rocket engineering team surrounding von Braun would prove by far the most consequential in terms of long-term historical impact. If the hidden ethical complexities behind pivotal moments of 20th century technological history interest the viewer, the channel invites a subscription every week. This series traces the human and moral costs behind the machines and programs that shaped the modern era. Von Braun and his core engineering team were initially relocated to Fort Bliss, Texas, and subsequently to Huntsville, Alabama, where they were assigned to work on American ballistic missile development under the U.S. Army's Ordnance Corps, applying the same fundamental engineering principles that had produced the V-2 to a new generation of American military rockets. The team's work throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s produced the Redstone rocket, a direct technological descendant of the V-2 that would go on to serve as both a nuclear-capable ballistic missile for the United States Army and, critically, as the launch vehicle for America's first crewed spaceflight in 1961, establishing a direct technical lineage between Nazi Germany's wartime rocket program and the earliest achievements of American human spaceflight. The strategic calculation that had justified the ethically fraught recruitment effort was, from a narrow technological standpoint, vindicated relatively quickly. Von Braun's team provided the United States with rocket engineering expertise that would otherwise have taken years and potentially an entire additional generation of independent research to develop domestically. This advantage became increasingly consequential as the Cold War intensified and rocket technology assumed a strategic significance measured not merely in military terms, but in the broader ideological competition between American and Soviet systems, a competition that would soon extend from ballistic missile development into the far more publicly visible arena of space exploration. The Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite in October 1957, transformed the strategic and public significance of the rocket engineering expertise the United States had acquired through Operation Paperclip. American public and political reaction to Sputnik amounted to a genuine national crisis of confidence, driven by the sudden and unambiguous demonstration that Soviet rocket technology had achieved a capability the United States had not yet matched, with immediate and unsettling implications for both national security and national prestige. In the reorganization of American space and missile programs that followed, von Braun's team, still based in Huntsville and by this point deeply integrated into the American engineering establishment, found themselves elevated from a specialized military research group into central figures within the newly established National Aeronautics and Space Administration, created in 1958 specifically to consolidate and accelerate American space efforts. Von Braun himself became one of the most publicly visible faces of the American space program throughout the late 1950s and 1960s, appearing in televised programming, popular magazine features, and consultative roles that presented him primarily as a visionary space pioneer, an image that, for a significant portion of the American public during this period, existed largely separate from any detailed public awareness of his wartime role in developing weapons responsible for thousands of civilian deaths, or his team's association with a production facility built on forced labor. This carefully managed public image, cultivated in part through deliberate government and media framing during the early Cold War period, would remain the dominant popular understanding of von Braun for decades, even as more complete historical documentation of his wartime record gradually became available to researchers and, eventually, to the broader public. Von Braun's team and the broader American rocket engineering establishment their expertise had helped seed culminated in the development of the Saturn V rocket, the launch vehicle that carried American astronauts to the moon during the Apollo program, beginning with the first crewed lunar landing in July 1969. The Saturn V remains, by several measures, the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown, and its development, under von Braun's direct technical leadership, represented the definitive culmination of the trajectory that had begun with the V2 program at Peenemünde nearly 3 decades earlier. The same fundamental engineering principles, refined and scaled dramatically upward, carrying a very different payload toward a fundamentally different purpose. The historical assessment of this trajectory has grown considerably more complicated in the decades. Since the Apollo program's conclusion, as more complete documentation of the Mittelwerk facility's forced labor practices, the sanitization processes underlying Operation Paperclip, and the specific wartime conduct of individual team members has become available to historians and the public. Arthur Rudolph's 1984 departure from the United States, undertaken specifically to avoid formal legal proceedings regarding his wartime conduct at Mittelwerk, represented one of the few instances in which the moral complications underlying Operation Paperclip received sustained public and legal scrutiny, prompting broader historical reconsideration of the program and the individuals who had participated in it, including von Braun himself, whose own wartime SS membership and direct knowledge of conditions at Mittelwerk have received considerably more critical historical examination in recent decades than during his lifetime. The moral and historical questions surrounding Operation Paperclip resist simple resolution, precisely because the program's technical outcomes and its ethical foundations remain so thoroughly intertwined. The same engineering expertise that killed thousands of civilians in London and Antwerp, and that was developed using a production system responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of forced laborers, directly enabled the technological achievements that placed American astronauts on the lunar surface less than a quarter-century later. This is not a case in which a clean historical narrative can separate the celebrated achievement from its troubling origins. The Saturn V's F1 engines and the V2's fundamental propulsion architecture exist on a single, continuous line of engineering development, carried forward by many of the same individuals across both projects. Standing before a preserved Saturn V rocket today, a visitor confronts a genuinely difficult historical object, an engineering achievement that remains, by any technical measure, one of the most remarkable accomplishments of the 20th century, developed in significant part through the deliberate legal and moral compromises of a government program that knowingly sanitized the wartime records of individuals connected to forced labor and civilian casualties, in pursuit of a strategic advantage judged, at the time, to outweigh those compromises. What Operation Paperclip ultimately demonstrates is not a simple story of redemption or of unexamined complicity, but a considerably more uncomfortable truth about how technological progress and moral compromise have, throughout the 20th century, frequently traveled together, inseparable in ways that later generations continue to find difficult to fully reconcile. Viewers interested in this story of hidden post-war technology transfer are directed to a related story, how the Soviet Union secretly reverse-engineered an American B-29 bomber into the Tupolev Tu-4, and what that program revealed about the early years of the Cold War arms race. Thanks for watching.